Hey you! Have you ever heard of this game? If you've been following me on social media for any amount of time within the last 5 years, chances are you probably have, because it's literally all I talk about. Interestingly enough, the dev of this game actually hasn't revealed much lore, so that means there's a lot of room for theory crafting. But besides this fangad, you know what else I'm into? Psychology. The human mind. As harrowing as it may be at times, I'm strangely fascinated with it. I'm particularly interested in jungian psychology. To explain it super briefly, jungian psychology is a branch of analytical psychology that includes concepts and theories developed by Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychoanalyst. I'm probably pronouncing his surname wrong, but I don't know German. Up to a certain point, a lot of Jung's theories are in some way connected to Sigmund Freud's theories, because Freud and Jung were actually partners for some time, but their partnership eventually ended because Freud was being low-key, high-key a weirdo, and Jung decided he didn't really want to work with him anymore. Jung is best known for various theories, including introversion and extroversion, the shadow, and archetypes. Obviously there's a lot more, but I'd argue these are among the most popular. So how do these connect with each other? You read the title. This guy may or may not be a living metaphor for the Jungian shadow. Let me explain. Now there are a lot of things that can be said about the DRL cast and how they might connect to Jungian psychology. For example, Forte represents the mother or caregiver archetype, while Missy is the father or ruler archetype. They both seek to protect, but Forte does so in a compassionate, nurturing manner, while Missy leads with strength and authority. Echo is the everyman, in the sense they're literally the most average person to exist, generally content with their life, while Lyle is the rebel, challenging the rules and wanting to change or eliminate things he doesn't think are right or just. These two archetypes may create an interesting dynamic of hostility, as the everyman is pretty non-confrontational, while the rebel outright desires and causes conflict. Obviously, these are only a part of the whole thing. Sometimes they show behavior of other archetypes besides just these ones, but that's not really the point anyway. Today, we are specifically dissecting Cyrus Suryc, and my theory about him being a walking embodiment of the shadow.
By the way, this is me on the phone mic. Hi. You may notice that, like, in this video, this is my first time reading from a script. I don't usually do scripts, because I feel like they just make me sound weird. So I may also be sounding weird here, like kind of unnatural and forced. Also, this has spoilers for the game, especially Chapter 2. Yeah, obviously.
But first, what is the shadow? To understand what it is, we must first establish a few important concepts. The ID, ego, superego, ego ideal, and persona. You may recognize the first three from Freudian psychology, but we don't talk about Freud here. Simply put, the ID is instincts, such as hunger at first, impulse for aggression, emotional outbursts, need for gratification, etc. The ego is reality. It's what holds the ID back and tells it, no, let's think about this and be rational. The superego is morality, and is the source of feelings like guilt. Generally speaking, a healthy psyche places the ego in charge, with the ID and superego both being respectively controlled. A neurotic psyche places the superego in charge, causing overthinking and anxiety due to a way stronger sense of morals, almost muffling the ID and ego. The ego ideal, or superego ideal, is what the ego wants to be. Check out this diagram. For the sake of simplicity, we'll say the outer world is how you present yourself on the outside, while the inner world is what's going on inside your mind in secret. The persona is the outermost point of consciousness, representing the mask you put on while in the presence of other people. A subject can have one or multiple personas. Also, the self doesn't matter too much, but I'll explain it too. It's a little hard to grasp, but the self is basically the whole, consciousness and unconsciousness combined. A common way to represent it is like this. Let's say this little dot in the center is the ego. There is a circular outline surrounding the dot. This circle is the self, that is everything including the ego. Got it? Cool. Anima and animus also don't matter here, so we could just scrap that. And now you see the shadow is on polar opposites of the globe with the persona. Persona and shadow are contrasted, but the actual conflict lies between the shadow and ego, with the shadow usually being equated to the ID. Okay, now what is the shadow? The shadow is described as an unconscious aspect of the personality that does not correspond with the ego ideal, leading the ego to resist and project the shadow, creating conflict with it. Essentially, the shadow is the part of your personality that you deem unjust or incorrect, and that deserves to be suppressed. Yet the shadow may still influence your behavior and thought patterns through cognitive distortion, an exaggerated or irrational thought that causes the subject to perceive reality inaccurately. And, to give you an idea, depression and anxiety are packed with these distortions. Ultimately, the goal is to make peace between the ID and ego and integrate with the shadow, not to the point you're only driven by instinct and emotion, but to the point where the ego is still dominant but lives in harmony with the ID. A lot of the time, the shadow contains negative behaviors and thought patterns, but it can be positive too, such as suppressing your ambition or creativity. Frequently, with a neurotic subject, the shadow is made of positive aspects to some extent, but they are muffled by the superego, causing feelings of anxiety, depression, irritability, and self-consciousness. And, as with a lot of things in psychology, this process generally starts developing during childhood. So that's fun and all, but how does this tie into Cyrus's character so heavily that I dare say he embodies the concept as a prime example? It's probably already obvious to some of you, but the answer lies in Chapter 2. And a little bit of late Chapter 1. That whole thing. To make this easier for all of us, we'll say Cyrus has two personas, Charisma and Confidential Informant. Technically free if you look at the old version, but shut up. The funny thing is that Cyrus is almost always using a very intense persona. Most people use personas, but Cyrus is like persona squared, persona cubed even. I suppose the closest thing we get to his true self is right in his dying moments. Interestingly, during this moment, he talks about himself very negatively, displaying depressive and self-conscious behaviors. In the old version of the game, this was more obvious, he's just straight up insulting himself. But in the new version, it's a lot more subtle, and I feel like that's why a lot of people don't really understand his character in the end. Let's assume he starts showing his true colors immediately after getting shot. Also because he's literally dying, so more of his unconscious behaviors could come out, you get what I'm saying? First off, he asks Ashley what she's trying to do while she's putting her hands on his wound to stop the bleeding. It's like he's confused or surprised at the fact someone finds his life worth saving. Conversely, this implies he himself thinks his life is worthless. He then refers to the Preservation Project as a miserable organization that I contributed to. By acknowledging it as miserable, it's possible he feels guilt for contributing to a malign cause. This line also implies he may have been threatened or coerced in some way to do his job, which would further negatively impact his psyche. Although Cyrus's superego has way too much control over him, he attempts to prevent Ashley from suffering the same by saying she shouldn't feel guilty for killing him. This further proves the fact he has depressive and suicidal thought processes and feels like he deserves to die. In fact, I'm not sure if this is still true now, but when the old version of the game was still up, the developer said Cyrus intended to kill himself, but was too afraid to do so since he didn't want to leave his friends behind. This is why he schemed that whole plan to get someone else to kill him. It's selfish, but you can't deny it's also pitiful. He then says, I should have never involved myself with you all, which can be interpreted as something along the lines of I should have never tried to befriend you all, implying that he doesn't think he's too good for them, but rather that he thinks he's unworthy of their company and deserves to stay alone. I don't deserve to be loved, others should not bother with me kind of mindset. He says you might hate me for this, as if he's expecting such a response, like it's only natural to do so, and he apologizes for getting killed by Ashley, even though he is the victim, so he owes her absolutely nothing. So this whole thing shows his superego and sense of morality and guilt overpowering his ego through a need to apologize or atone for things he should not apologize for, which is very much characteristic of a neurotic psyche. As a consequence of his psyche, he has developed depressive and self-conscious thought processes and behaviors. I'd like to say there's traces of anxiety as well, which I'll come back to later. So his shadow is a sad and suicidal young man that hates himself and believes he's a piece of shit that doesn't deserve nobody. But what about his personas? Yeah, that whole thing was kind of a side tangent. From the start of the game, Cyrus introduces himself as the ultimate charisma. This persona of his is kind, chill as fuck, and in his words, cooperative. This guy is your best friend without even talking to him. As established previously, the persona contrasts with the shadow. Cyrus's shadow is a miserable, lonely, ashamed, self-loathing, suicidal victim of coercion, while charisma is the opposite, in one way. He never shows suffering, he never shows anything even close to suicidality or self-hatred. The most we get is him just being angry about the fact Pandora died, but he very quickly tried to suppress that too. Charisma shows almost no negative emotion ever, in fact, or at least not too strongly. He focuses on complimenting and helping others, as well as maintaining an optimistic outlook on his situation. I would argue that by using this persona, he's trying to gain friends. He tries to make people spend time with him, trying to make himself look more appealing by perhaps concealing his negative emotions, and he's always nice to them, so maybe they'll give him a chance. His shadow begs to differ. It thinks he's not worthy of such connections, but as always, it is suppressed. And he mentions absolutely nothing about being tied to the project, unless someone else calls him out on it. Then comes the confidential informant. This persona is the opposite of the shadow in the other way. He's cold, reclusive, and callous, and taunts and threatens everybody around him. At first, everybody else assumes this is the true Cyrus because that's what he said, but as Missy so put it, he said the Cyrus we knew before wasn't the real him, but could it be the other way around? His behavior under the charisma title seemed organic. From this, we can infer that, at the very least, charisma is closer to Cyrus's ego/self than confidential informant is. This asshole no longer conceals his involvement with the project, instead appearing to almost take pride in it, freely giving out bracelets of missing students and describing precisely what his job is, despite the suspicion it raises. Yet this doesn't correspond with the shadow either. We've established Cyrus's shadow is primarily characterized by feelings of guilt, shame, intense depression, and self-loathing, partially tied to the project. Charisma suppresses this entirely by acting like everything is fine and he is innocent, while confidential informant suppresses it by seemingly embracing it, rather than being ashamed. But he's actually not embracing it at all. As mentioned previously, a healthy psyche is mainly rational, letting the ego dominate the ID and superego. Successful integration with the shadow implies the ID and ego can live in harmony, with the ego still being dominant. Charisma refuses to even think about the shadow/ID, pushing it to the very back of his mind and trying not to let it break free whatsoever. But there are still a few examples about influencing him. Confidential informant is not at peace with it either. His ID appears exaggerated as he acts much more irrationally. It's dominating his ego and superego. Instead of showing the shame that's coming from his shadow, he shows pride, which looks like it helps but it really doesn't, as he's still not coming to terms with how he actually feels about the situation. He doesn't have the balance of a healthy psyche. He is still failing to make proper peace with his shadow. And he still ends up feeling guilty in the end. It all comes back to his neurotic, superego-driven psyche, which he cannot escape no matter how many different masks he tries. The shadow pains him, he wants to escape it, but it's a constant looming presence. It's either he tries to integrate it, which he can't do or doesn't know how, or he simply obeys what the shadow orders. One thing that's been kinda lost in all of this is his ego. We know his personas and his primarily negative shadow that he's always suppressing in some way, but it's still a bit hard to exactly pinpoint what his ego/self is. Who really is the true Cyrus? Also, since ego and self are synonymous a lot of the time, I'll just start referring to them together as ES for simplicity. Once again, the most we have is that, supposedly, charisma seems closer to Cyrus's ES than confidential informant, and that his dying moments, where more of his shadow is subtly revealed, is as close as we could get to his true ES. One of my ideas is that whenever he was using his charisma persona, that's kinda basically his ego because he was usually being rational about things. That's the easy way out. But I don't really like the easy way, so we're gonna try and grasp the harder equation. The self. We can suppose that Cyrus's self is his personas, shadow, and ego or rationality combined. Due to the neurotic nature of his psyche, his ego is kinda weak, but he can use his charisma persona to try and mask that. And this is where the anxiety comes in. I didn't want to lump it in with the other stuff earlier because a lot of this section is just stuff that's pulled out of my ass and I felt like it deserved to be separate, but just hear me out. I feel like Cyrus's ES is decently similar to charisma, but also way more anxious. I always felt like his introduction must have been scripted out in his head or something. Like, nobody says these things? It's possible he was overthinking on what to say for a good first impression, and as a result, he ended up sounding kind of unnatural and forced and, like, very extravagant. Not to mention how he's basically always glazing echo. So this shows his kindness and charm from his persona, but also some of his suppressed neurotic behaviors that are projections from his shadow. It's the conscious and unconscious combined. That's basically his self. While we're on the topic of his anxious behaviors, I swear his shoulders must be perpetually tense. Like, just look at this shit. But, if we've already established the fact he has depressive behaviors, depression and anxiety tend to go hand in hand, so it's more of a pretty basic logical deduction than something supported with evidence. But a stronger reason for why he could have anxiety is due to his involvement with the project. Once again, this may have been changed, but it's been confirmed in the old version that he basically couldn't say jack shit about it lest he be killed or otherwise harmed in some crucial way. Constantly having your own life on the line, whether literally or figuratively, I imagine, would be pretty anxiety-inducing. Especially for someone that's already depressed and suicidal with a low self-esteem that has most likely been going on since childhood. Like, you can't tell me Cyrus had a healthy home life. You just can't. This is absolutely not the life of someone with normal parents. Well, that sure was a lot of words to say if each DRL character was meant to perfectly embody a certain Jungian concept, Cyrus would be the shadow. If you listened and paid attention to this whole thing, thank you, and I'm sorry. I've always had a lot of fun psychoanalyzing fictional characters, and Cyrus especially, because I feel like he actually turns out to be pretty relatable to a lot of people once we really pick at his brain. I've been saying for years that his character is definitely extremely deep and people just don't get him like I do, but I've never known how to properly explain it until now. But also, I'm still a total beginner at Jungian psychology, so if anyone that's more knowledgeable on it was to give me constructive criticism, then I would appreciate it. I also try to explain everything as simply as I could, but I feel like I still ended up metaphorically doing donuts and it didn't make much sense in the end, but like, honestly, I'm too tired to revise this whole thing. I'm a high school student, you think I have the time? But anyways, I hope this made you learn something new about my favorite fictional character of all time. And or psychology. Okay, bye!